We know that Donald Trump ordered Pam Bondi to go after his political opponents by saying, open an investigation on Bill Clinton, open an investigation on Bill Gates, open an investigation on Reid Hoffman, who is the LinkedIn co-founder and a big donor to the Democratic Party. Now, there is no basis that we know of to open those investigations, absolutely none. So if justice uses that as an excuse today, they are covering for Trump or other people by using his enemies as their pretext, as their cover.
Professor Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Hey, thanks so much for starting Friday with me, Maddie.
It's a bittersweet end to the year, Scott. Just for the audience to know, you're my last guest before I go home, and you've been a crowd favorite. So it's good to have you on because we've had so much news really catered towards your expertise, actually. So I want to start off with what happened late on Thursday. House Oversight Democrats have released multiple photos from Jeffrey Epstein's estate on the eve of the 30-day deadline for the DOJ to release any information and documents that they have in their possession. So we saw the release of around 19 photos last week, and then we've seen some photos released on Thursday. So Scott, your reaction to seeing the latest photos, what was the worst of it?
I mean, I think this was the third photo drop that the Democrats in the House Oversight Committee have done as we move up towards this deadline today to actually see the criminal case files of Jeffrey Epstein. The drop yesterday, I think we need to start with the fact Donald Trump is nowhere in the photo drop yesterday. He has been mentioned in previous drops and in the Epstein emails. We just simply wait to see what comes out in the full files. But even though Trump wasn't there, there's some interesting context that comes out of the photos. Multiple photos of Epstein, of course, in his residences, in the apartment, and then of people who are around Epstein or who basically drop in, whether it's for business, whether it's socially. And it's a range of names. And you have to say this goes back to how well connected Epstein was, how he liked to collect people around him as he tried to network. So Bill Gates is there with an unidentified woman whose face is redacted, so she can't be named. And it's like, okay, we know that Bill Gates' marriage broke in part because of that connection with Epstein. What does that add? There's no context. None of these photos have any context around them, so you just simply have what you have there. Noam Chomsky, who, full disclosure, used to be a major influence on both my academic work and then on my political work until I sort of got a bit disillusioned with him. Noam Chomsky is there, even though he is like this figure on the left who is always critical of American corporate power, is critical of American foreign policy. And here he is basically alongside Epstein, and in addition to emails that establish their correspondence. And then you get David Brooks, who won't be as well known, I think, in the UK, but he's a very prominent New York Times columnist who only a few weeks ago was writing a column about Epstein and effectively was saying, look, really, is there that much here that we need to be discussing? Aren't we overdoing this? And lo and behold, David Brooks shows up at an event where Epstein is. The New York Times had to issue a clarification yesterday to say, well, he was just there covering this business event, and so on. But the point is, it was in, I think, 2011, which was after the first criminal cases against Epstein over the pedophilia, which were in Florida. So, I think it's a wider story about American society and about American power that came out. That won't satisfy those who want to get to closure on Trump, but in a wider sense, I think you and I have always emphasized this story of Epstein and his pedophilia has this troubling connection with how American power operates. And as you try to get justice and closure for the victims, we need identification not just of Trump if he is implicated. We need identification of anybody who was in a position of influence who abused that position, as well as abusing these girls.
And that's kind of the premise of where we're at, Scott, because if you and I discussed at great lengths what Thomas Massey, the Republican congressman, as we've said, has emphasized is that he's seen victims' testimony, he's seen the allegations of those who they've named. And so his argument is that the DOJ must release these files to name high-profile people that these victims have said abuse them, and that, the rich don't get away with this, the powerful don't get away with this. So that's the whole point of why House Oversight Democrats are drip feeding these photos. They're trying to keep the headlines in the public eye so that we don't keep the pressure off those that might be named, off the Department of Justice, off the Trump administration, because they're just in power right now. So you mentioned these high profile people that were named in the latest drop. So yes, Bill Gates, Noam Chomsky, Woody Allen again, Steve Bannon again, they're all pictured. Just to emphasize, there is no criminal wrongdoing pictured in these latest batch of photos, but at the very least, it kind of puts them in a bad light, Scott.
Yeah, it does. And I want to add one dimension that I think I found most troubling, which may not grab that many headlines because there's no famous person specifically named here. There is passport information, which is, and it's heavily redacted for obvious reasons. But these passports appear to be of at least young women, because the one case I looked at yesterday was an 18-year-old who moved from Russia into the Schengen area and then to the U.S. And so these young women, maybe girls, were being moved, and then there's a screen grab of a text exchange, which
I'm going to read it out. Scott, I'm going to interrupt you. Read it out and get your reaction.
Go ahead and read that out for us.
Yeah, so this is the WhatsApp exchange. We don't know who really it's from and who to, but it says, I don't know, try to send someone else. I have a friend Scout. She sent me some girls today, but asks $1,000 per girl. I will send you girls now. Maybe someone will be good for Jay. And then it says name, redacted, 18-year-old, redacted, height, redacted, measurements, redacted, weight, redacted, departure city, Russia.
Yeah, and it actually mentions it went through the Schengen area, so therefore went from Russia through somewhere on continental Europe and then to the United States. And so that's trafficking. That appears to be trafficking of young women. For $1,000 a piece to move them across. It's not proven, but we assume that Jay refers to Epstein as his first initial. Now, look, if there's more like this in the files, what you have is you start to have a trail, which connects, of course, Epstein to the girls or maybe young women. I'm being careful here because there's the age of consent that, we could talk about. But they're being moved across. And that just highlights the importance of all of the files that we await, because we're talking here not just about screen grabs from WhatsApp. We're not just talking about the photos. We could be talking about witness statements. We could be talking about depositions of even of those who might be suspected of criminal activity, and audio, video. And what the Republican, Thomas Massey, said, who has really stood up against Trump and demanded the release of these files, is Massey says, look, if you look in these files, he says 20. He thinks he's got 20 high-profile men who can be identified here, either through the men being named in these files or, interestingly enough, through their lawyers. Because, of course, what would have happened here is if these men were suspected, the contact between the Justice Department may have been with their lawyers regarding, okay, what's the process in terms of the investigation? So there's going to be all kinds of trails that are going to have to be chased, which is sort of a cautionary note on two accounts. First of all, we may not get all the files today. We think we are going to get some files because House Democrats were saying yesterday they believe they will come out. But the Justice Department was letting it be known that they're scrambling to carry out all the redactions. Whether you believe that's real or excuse. But beyond that, even if we did get all the files today, there's going to have to be a lot of investigative work because this is raw material to connect the dots in terms of what leads where, which means a lot of caution. We know powerful men need to be identified if they're culpable, but people need to avoid jumping the gun before we've got hard evidence.
I couldn't agree with you more, Scott. And just for our audience, because they know that you and I will go through these things. We always do an analysis anytime there's something dropped, but from the Epstein files or anything from the oversight committee. But we probably won't have the opportunity to do that because, as you said, it's going to take time. We don't know how many documents. There could be thousands and thousands of documents that drop. It will take time to go through them. But one of the cause for concerns has been how much will be redacted. So, as we said, the DOJ, the Attorney General Pam Bondi, she must release files today from the Department of Justice. But we are expecting there to be some redactions, whether it be due to national security concerns about sex trafficking, or it could be because perhaps they'll say that there are open investigations into some of the things. So what do you think will happen in terms of these redactions?
I think we need to make a distinction between two different, effectively, causes for redaction. And one of these causes is absolutely legitimate. And that is, look, if you've got girls who are named in these files, girls, and they will now be women, you've got to protect their identities. They've suffered enough. You don't need them being outed, right? If you've got witnesses to these events, which could be criminal events, they need to be protected. There are security concerns which take place there. If you've got names of people who are not implicated in criminal activity, let's say people who happen to know Epstein and so on, if there's something that could give the misleading impression that they're involved in a crime, you've got to protect that. And that's legitimate. And I've dealt with that in a series of other cases over the years. What you're talking about on the second level, however, of redaction is to cover someone's backside. And that is, you redact information because you don't want someone's name to come out. And of course, Trump is one of the names that we talk about. And that's absolutely illegitimate. And I think what's going to happen here is as the files come out, you're going to see different groups trying to sift through this. You're going to see, obviously, I think, Democrats as well as people like Thomas Massie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, another Republican opponent of Trump on this, who are going to go through to say, are the redactions justified? Then you're going to have journalists going through it to see, if there's justification. And then you're going to have lawyers going through it here because, of course, there may be cause for further action from these files that come out. Now, I will say one overall sweeping thing. If the Justice Department comes out and says, look, we had to carry out redactions because we have ongoing investigations, that is a huge red flag because I want to make this clear. All investigations into Epstein's pedophilia had been effectively resolved at the end of 2024 with the Ghislaine Maxwell case being resolved. Now, you can make the argument that there should have been more criminal cases pursued. We could talk about that. But in terms of the reason why the files could be released in 2025 is because there were no open investigations. We know that Donald Trump ordered Pam Bondi to go after his political opponents by saying, open an investigation on Bill Clinton, open an investigation on Bill Gates, open an investigation on Reid Hoffman, who is the LinkedIn co-founder and a big donor to the Democratic Party. Now, there is no basis that we know of to open those investigations. Absolutely none. So if justice uses that as an excuse today, they are covering for Trump or other people by using his enemies as their pretext, as their cover.
Let's get into this New York Times article, Scott. So just for our audience to understand, on the eve of the DOJ having to release these files, the New York Times wrote it was a large, detailed article where they interviewed former staffers of Jeffrey Epstein. I think they interviewed around 30. So here's just a summary of what they said. So this is in regards to the friendship between Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. So through sources, they said that the article reads that they pursued women in a game of ego and dominance. Female bodies were currency. One source described it as trophy hunting, a pissing contest who had the most women. Multiple sources described frequent contact and explicit sex talk, including phone calls at least 3 times a week between Trump and Epstein. Trump is described by one former assistant as Epstein's most reliable wingman and recalls Trump regaling Mr. Epstein with tales of his sexual exploits. So, I mean, your reaction to this?
Look, I will give you the hook line for this. The only thing that is saving Donald Trump at this point, politically and legally, is the age of consent. That's the only thing that's saving him. Because, and again, our viewers will know this, there is that distinction between a young woman and a girl. Now, others have testified over the years that Trump was always with young women, not girls, right? So he was always on the right side of the age of the consent. And we have to make it clear for the record, there is no evidence out there that I know of, and I hasten to be corrected, that Trump had sexual relations with someone who was below the age of consent, although he was in the presence of girls with Epstein. We also need to make that clear. Now, what you get from this testimony from the sturdy staff is that Trump had absolutely no limits, no compunctions in terms of the young women he pursued. We know this from multiple other cases, however, regarding Trump. We know it from the way that he ran the Miss America and the Miss Universe pageants. We actually know this from the way that he acted on The Apprentice, on his reality TV show. We know it from the fact that more than 20 women, and I will have to double check my numbers, but at least more than 20 of them have accused him of sexual abuse, sometimes amounting to sexual assault. We know that he has been convicted of defamation with respect to a case of sexual assault in which a judge called it tantamount to rape. So we know Donald Trump's record of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and we know that he bragged about it because a year after he supposedly fell out with Epstein over a property deal in 2005, he's on the Access Hollywood tape bragging to, Billy Bush, who hosted this entertainment program, about grabbing women. And we won't repeat the rest of that. So we know all this. What has been interesting, just to cut to the chase here, is Donald Trump has been able to slide on this, partly because of the devotion of his supporters, and partly because there is a troubling fallback in American society, more than a decade after Me Too, which actually rationalizes, justifies, and excuses violence against women.
And I just want to emphasize that this New York Times article doesn't have any source in it that accuses Trump of any wrongdoing or shows any proof of any wrongdoing from the president. However, one source said that Epstein introduced himself as Trump's best friend. And then part of the article reads, Mr. Epstein and his partner Ghislaine Maxwell introduced at least 6 women who have accused them of grooming or abuse to Mr. Trump. One was a minor at the time. None have accused Mr. Trump himself of inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, but again, I think this summarizes exactly where we are here, which is Donald Trump was really close to Jeffrey Epstein. He was really close to Epstein. The only reason why Trump falls out with Epstein, and we can put this all together, and it is not because Epstein was taking girls who worked at Mar-a-Lago. We know from Epstein's email that the indication is Trump knew about that. So from Epstein's point of view, that is not why they fell out. The best evidence we have is they fell out because they competed for a big property deal down in Florida, which interestingly enough, and I need to check this out, maybe that infamous Palm Beach mansion that was later purchased by the Russians in effectively what might have been a money laundering case. I'll leave that to the side for the moment. What we have here is that Trump was in the company of Epstein up until at least 2004, 2005, and there were girls who were present. We do not know the relationship, the extent of that relationship between the girls and Donald Trump. But there's a second level, Maddie, here that has not been emphasized, but comes out because of what you and I talked earlier about these photos. Was Trump in the presence of young women who had been trafficked? Even though those women are above the age of consent, if they have been trafficked, and if he has any knowledge that they may have been trafficked, then he also faces liability.
And that's a question that's not isolated just to Trump. That's a question that will be for anyone in Epstein's orbit, anyone that denies any wrongdoing but was kind of present for these trafficked women, trafficked girls that were there and either turned a blind eye or didn't raise questions with Jeffrey Epstein. And that's, we'll put that question to a side until we see more information as these, hopefully, DOJ documents are released today. But let's move on to something else happening today, which is that, late last night, EU leaders, they held a summit yesterday in Brussels. They were trying to lobby Belgium to release tens of billions of euros worth of frozen Russian assets that were confiscated when the invasion began. So Belgium had been apprehensive, worrying that they would be retaliated against by Russia. However, EU leaders finished the summit by agreeing to borrow a cash loan of up to 90 billion euros to Ukraine to fund its defense against Russia for the next 2 years, rather than use these frozen assets. So the president of the European Commission has tweeted saying that we have a deal decision to provide 90 billion euros of support to Ukraine for 2026, 2027, approved. We committed, we delivered. I mean, Scott, it's not exactly the outcome we wanted, but what sort of lifeline has these EU leaders just handed Ukraine?
You know, Maddie, it's hard sometimes to make economics and financial stories dramatic, and it can be really hard to make the European Union's bureaucracy dramatic. But this may be, in fact, I think it is one of the most dramatic moments in Ukraine's 47-month resistance against Russia's full-scale invasion. The fundamental here is that to maintain that resistance against Russia's invasion, and I don't think there will be a ceasefire because Vladimir Putin wants more Ukrainian territory. He wants to break the country. He wants to keep it weak. So that means you have to continue to defend Ukraine, and that includes not just military defense, but its financial needs. Keeping the government running, keeping public services running, providing transportation, education, healthcare. And the estimated cost for the next 2 years through 2027 is 135 billion euros, right? So the EU's initial idea was that you were going to finance this through what's called a reparations loan. Now, that reparations loan would be drawn from frozen Russian assets because the Russians are liable for all the damage they've caused Ukraine since February 2022. And I think that would have gone through, except the sticking point is that Belgium holds about 88% of Russian assets. And a lot of those are held through a Belgian company called Euroclear. And the Russians threatened Belgium. They said, look, if you agree to this reparations loan, you know, we're going to, in fact, they filed lawsuits. They've already filed, I think, a $230 billion lawsuit against Euroclear. They have been reportedly intimidating Euroclear officials and Belgian government officials. That's according to European intelligence agencies. And at the same time, the United States, the Trump administration made the threat to the EU, look, if you approve this reparations loan, we will get that money back. I think because they're protecting future U.S.-Russian economic projects. Anyway, all of that meant that Belgium took a hard line and would not agree to the reparations loan. And if Belgium doesn't agree to it, you can't go ahead with it. And at that point, you're thinking, that's it, man. Ukraine is stranded. When this was developing a few weeks ago, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission head, said, all right, look, we'll take some of the money from a reparations loan, but we'll borrow some of the money, right? We'll effectively find it from other sources. And what happened here last night is that idea took hold, which is, all right, if you can't get the reparations loan, let's provide 90 billion euros, about 2/3 of what Ukraine needs over the next 2 years, through a loan against our budget, right? In other words, we will find it from our member states and we will keep Ukraine going. The barrier to that had been, and the reason why the EU had not done that before is the fear that it would be vetoed by one of Putin's friends, especially Viktor Orban in Hungary, possibly Robert Fico in Slovakia. In the end, as he has done on multiple occasions, Orban did not follow through with the threat to veto. We don't know what incentives he got, if he got any incentives not to veto. We know that he's boasting to his public this morning that Hungary, as well as Slovakia and the Czech Republic, don't have to contribute to that loan. So he's like, yay, I saved us money. All right, big damn deal, Orban. That doesn't matter. The other 24 states have agreed that 90 billion euro loan. And as Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, said last night, this is a victory for our resistance. This is a victory for resilience. We can keep going. Because, again, you and I just talked about Ukraine on multiple levels. And the level that this comes down to is you have to have money to resist an invasion, but you also have to have money to carry out an invasion. And we have the juxtaposition of Ukraine getting support from Europe. If Vladimir Putin continues to have a plunge in his oil revenues, which will be cut by almost 50% by the end of this year, and if the U.S. does not roll back sanctions, who's going to finance Vlad? Who's going to bail him out to keep his invasion going?
there's been these questions over where EU leaders will get this money from. The ideal situation, as I mentioned, would be that Russia starts the war, Russia pays for the war, but that hasn't been the situation, as you mentioned. And I think it's interesting to talk about why Belgium blocked it, because when I had Bill Browder on the show yesterday, he believes that Belgium is blocking it due to safety concerns for the head of Euroclear, as you said, and Belgium's PM believing that there was probably threats on their lives if they were to carry through with this. But the Kremlin are gloating about the fact that EU leaders didn't agree unanimously to use these frozen assets. So Kirill Dmitriev, he tweeted, Scott, he said, major blow to EU warmongers, led by failed Ursula, voices of reason in the EU blocked the illegal use of Russian reserves to fund Ukraine. Law and sanity win for now. I mean, regardless, 90 billion euros is going straight into the hands of Ukraine to continue fighting, to continue this offensive, to continue the fact that they want to win this war on their own terms. So, Scott, I mean, when we see this gloating from Kirill Dmitriev, is it almost as if Putin's worried?
Absolutely. You know, at one level, I don't give a flying fig what Kirill Dmitriev says, because Kirill Dmitriev, like others in the Kremlin inner circle, are spinning propaganda and trying to get the media to bite on all their misinformation and disinformation. At another level, I'll play the connect the dots for you. What has happened in the past, well, in late October, Kirill Dmitriev, the same person you just quoted, he thought he had sealed the deal with the Trump administration to break Ukraine, because he was the guy who was in Florida working out that 28-point ultimatum with the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, who is supposedly an envoy, and with Donald Trump's very real son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And that ultimatum, remind you, was like, okay, let's give more Ukrainian territory to Russia, the Donetsk region in the east of the country. Let's keep Ukraine militarily and economically weak, effectively partitioning the country and limiting Western aid. And you know what? Kirill Dmitriev and Vladimir Putin didn't get that through. The Europeans and Ukraine pushed back. And as I speak to you, we've come out of meetings in Berlin where for the first time the Europeans and Kyiv have gotten a plan for U.S. as well as European and international security guarantees. If we halt the invasion, there is a full plan now for European troops inside Ukraine, for the U.S. to lead the air support to protect Ukraine against a further Russian attack. So what's the Kremlin going to have to do now? Oh, heck. They're sending Kirill Dmitriev back out to Florida this weekend to meet the real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, at his club, probably outside Miami, because the Kremlin have to try to bounce the Trump administration again. Don't give these security guarantees. Don't make a ceasefire. Give us territory. So what Dmitriev is trying to do is, you notice he will not insult the U.S., nor will Vladimir Putin insult the U.S. They're trying to win the United States back by saying Europe has no role here. Because just before Dmitriev said, oh yeah, Europe, blah, 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 that 90 billion euros, yeah, what does that matter? What matters, mate, is it's 90 billion euros. Vladimir Putin gets out there and he's got his general, Gerasimov, the guy who screwed up the invasion, beside him. And he's going, oh, what can Europe do about this? They're all just simply Nazis. They're all little pigs. So apparently Europe has become Nazi piglets, right? That's guys who are thumping their chest to try to project that they're the strong people when they're covering up a position of possible weakness. We're going to go into the winter, and the Kremlin are going to make their big effort to break Ukraine's energy infrastructure. They're going to try to break Ukraine financially. They're going to try to break them on the front lines. But if Europe stands firm behind Ukraine and other countries, hi Canada, they wonder if they can do that. They really wonder if they've got the space to do that. And so I'm going to repeat something to you that I said to Ukrainian journalists yesterday, Maddie, if you don't mind, because I garbled the quote. So I'm going to get it right for you here. In February 2022, Vladimir Putin, Kirill Dmitriev, Dmitry Medvedev, who may or may not have been sober at the time, and other folks thought, we are going to launch this full-scale invasion and we'll be within Kyiv within weeks, if not days. They had special forces at Hostomel Airport, just outside Kyiv. And you know what? Ukraine didn't break. Vladimir Zelensky, I'm going to get the quote right this time, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." Ukraine's government did not flee. They were not captured. Ukraine's military did not break. And most importantly, Ukrainians did not break. And what we saw yesterday was that the European Union, in its own cumbersome, bureaucratic, sometimes too slow way, recognized and maintained its support for those Ukrainians. We don't know if Donald Trump will. We don't know if J.D. Vance will. We don't know if Steve Witkoff will. But Europe did. And that is important. So yeah, Ukraine still stands, and Kirill Dmitriev goes to Florida. And I hope he can top up on his suntan in a Florida winter. And I hope Steve Witkoff doesn't have a Steve Witkoff lapse and decide to become Vladimir Putin's best buddy yet again.
Yeah, and we'll be waiting to watch what happens in Florida in the coming days. Professor Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you, Maddie. It's been a pleasure.